So Arianna Huffington recently was talking about that's a paradox of the age, that we live in a virtual society, but connecting with real human beings is really one of the highest priorities. I think it goes back to maybe to Tom Malone's point earlier. Anyway, we agree, obviously. We put on conferences where, in a virtual age, for people who are totally believers in technology's transformative potential, we should come together and actually do things face to face. So this next session is exploring that kind of idea, the limits of the virtual. It's going to be moderated by a very good friend of Techonomy, a longtime techonomist, Gary Bowles. So Gary, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you, optimists. All right. Wonderful. All right, we're all set. So first, I want to thank Simone and David for giving me such a fascinating and eclectic set of speakers for this session, and for a great time slot. Here we are at the end of the day. So I know that all of you are either highly fascinated and engaged and waiting for us to sort of wrap up a lot of the themes and issues of today, or your hunger has overtaken you and we look like a large buffet of hors d'oeuvres in your hallucinations. So we hope it's going to be the former one, and that we're going to be able to have a stimulating conversation. So the framing that Simone and David gave us, I'm just going to repeat, even though you can see this in your app, are: what are the limits of the digital in products, services, the workplace, and in business? Human relations, communications, education, training, science, medicine. So I want to thank them for giving us a very small subject to cover. And we'll be announcing the conference that we're all starting right now to cover these over the next couple of days. So while I realize that finding a counter perspective to the relentless positive attitude towards technology at a conference like Techonomy is a little challenging, like finding a Puritan at the Playboy Mansion. But I'm going to hope that we're going to find that sort of counter view in each of you, and explore some of the positives, but also some of the potential challenges of the virtual, and ask each of my speakers to be able to help us understand it from their perspective. So, I actually want to start off with Corey. So Corey is the VP of engineering at Facebook, and I think I annoyed him by pushing on some of these negative aspects when we were talking on the phone. So I made a great career move by having a powerful executive at a company that has 1 billion of us as its users, getting on the wrong side. But I just wanted to give you, I guess, a chance, Corey, because you really were involved early on in Second Life, which is, sort of, if you think of the spectrum of the virtual, from maybe texting somebody to all the way of having a full-on avatar in a completely virtual world. Second Life was certainly that. How many of you have ever been on Second Life? So, good number of people.
Wow.
So, that's great. So yeah, that's wonderful. So, so I just want to start off. So, because you obviously were immersed in that arena, how digital or virtual do you think of yourself personally as being? I mean, is there a percentage of the sort of information entertainment you take in virtually versus in the analog world, or how do you think of that balance in your life?
So I don't actually think about that balance very much. I think about media, I think about connections, I think about doing work, and I think what you're describing are different channels and different tools for staying connected with my friends, engaging in media, and really doing everything I do through my day-to-day life. And so, obviously anybody who's in the Valley is, off several standard deviations into the more technologically connected, because that's a basic part of how I do my job every day, right? I'm, connected to a large workforce. I'm connected to a large group of friends and colleagues who are, both in the Valley and also scattered. And so those who are farther away, so today is Veterans Day. And so I was in the Navy. And because when you look at me, you think Navy. And I know I get that all the time.
It's the earrings. That must be it.
Yeah, no, exactly. The good old pirate days. And so, so these are friends of mine who've been friends for 20 plus years, and we've been on very divergent career paths. Those who stayed in, those who didn't. And tools like Facebook are a completely key element of how I stay connected to these people, so that when I do get to cross paths with them physically, I'm already up to speed on what's going on, and I know where they are in their lives, and I know what's going on. And so Facebook's just a tool, but it's for doing all the things that make us very human. It just happens to be a particularly good tool at that.
Right. So the challenge, though, I guess, is that if you go back and you look at sort of just the sheer amount of communication that we're making. There's a researcher years ago that talked about sort of the strength of weak ties, and that there was only a certain number of people that we tended to know in society, and we had deep relationships and maybe a small number of weak relationships. But now social media lets us have a tremendous number of very weak relationships. So what are the ramifications of that? What are the positives and then potentially some of the challenges?
Well, I think there are a few different pieces of that. One, at some point during this conversation, someone was going to reference Dunbar's number, so I'll just take that one for all of you. So Dunbar talked about relationships between primates, and something that shows up over and over again is about 150 as being the limits of bands, of groups, and you just see this over and over again. And a reasonably open question in the research of how people connect electronically and through other technologically mediated connections is, does Dunbar's number apply, and exactly how does it apply? So I think, one, there's an assumption that it would apply in the same way that is one that we're still in the process of testing. So let's sort of set that aside for a moment. In the real world, we have wildly variant connections between people. Like, we have our close friends, we have our acquaintances, and I think, especially with acquaintances at a distance, those are weak ties anyway. And what technology lets us do is make those weak ties a little bit stronger and more useful. And I think that's incredibly useful. But all the way on the other side, if you talk about the people who are closest to me, my family, my best friends, technology is a key part of those connections as well. So again, I really view this as a tool. And I think if we were to go back through time and read news stories as the telephone was rolling out, we'd be having a very similar discussion about how the telephone was going to just be demolish face-to-face meetings. And I think we've seen this certainly with communication tech, as different communication technologies have rolled out. Over and over again, we ask questions about what does this do to us, as a society, as a community, to have different tools to stay connected to each other. And so, obviously, and we talked about this previously, as parents, it means we better be involved and understand the communication technologies involved. Like, it's probably helpful that I know what FaceTime is when my daughter asks to use FaceTime to do homework with, her friends, and she's 10, right? And so, I think there are questions there for all of us in terms of, are we aware of these changing technologies, and are we aware of how our kids are going to use them? But the neat part about so much of this tech coming to us through phones is this isn't like 20 years ago, where the tech was the personal computer, which broadly split into the very narrow subset of people who were using personal computers and their children who were seeing them in school, and most people were like, why would I ever need a computer? We heard today there are 1.9 billion smartphones in the world. If we look out over the next several years, we're going to bring 3 billion more people online. This is a ubiquitous technology. And so, unlike a lot of parenting moments in the past where it was this weird tech that your kids were using, and if we go back, radio was this, television was this, like, this is not a new transition. But what we see is that this one is a little bit different because we're all using phones all the time, and our kids may be using them in new and interesting ways that we aren't as familiar with, but at least we have some sense of what the technology can do because we're all using them every day also.
So I want to come back to the issue of kids and parent perspective in a little bit. Paul, I just want to ask you, so you come at this from a neuroscience standpoint, and some of the things that Corey's talking about in terms of this ubiquitous access, having the phones with us all the time. There's an article in the most recent New Yorker. Evgeny Morozov is talking about 2 chairs for boredom. He's basically saying that we're constantly gorging at this information table. We've got this stuff, this onslaught of information and of connections, information from people as we continually get our Facebook updates. But he likens it to empty calories. That so much of it is like it's like a constant diet of cotton candy. So how do you think about that in terms of the way our brains work, how we're managing this information flow, and some of the things that you think are some of the potential effects of that?
So we've run experiments on this, and I think I want to make an argument for a middle ground. It's not always in person or always virtual. As Corey said, we're connected all the time. And even before we had computers, we had all those connections. So we've done experiments that have looked at, for example, what happens in the brain when we use social media. We've shown that of any type, including tweeting, Facebook, people's brains release oxytocin. This chemical I discovered makes us trust others, makes us care about others. So as this, our brains are processing that flickering image as if I'm sitting talking to you in person. And so I don't think that there's a hard line in the brain between that. And so we've explored some other ways of configuring, for example, offices that might facilitate that. So we did a study recently with Herman Miller, one of the sponsors here, looked at something they call their living office. So taking sort of a coffee bar, the world's coolest coffee bar, that's got wireless everywhere, it's got people moving around, and then taking blood and measuring heart rate and skin conductance, respiration from 150 of their employees while they did real work tasks in that space versus a closed space. And we find that mood is better when I have people milling around me, when I have noise. I'm more productive, I solve problems better, I recover from stress better. This is really interesting because we sort of need the people around us. We need that noise. It's kind of nice. So I'm sure almost everyone in the audience would say, yeah, I work at a coffee shop sometimes. Sometimes I don't want to be at home. I just want to have some noise around me and that coffee machine going and whatever's going on. So somehow we need that connection. So it's not virtual or in person, it's blending these.
Right. So speaking of a blend, Alexa, I think you've got such a fascinating trajectory. I'd love to first tell people, maybe the one or two people who haven't used Paperless Post in the audience, what it is that you do and sort of just a brief trajectory of the company, but then talk a little bit about sort of that balance between the virtual and the real in what you folks offer.
Yeah, so there are a couple ways that we balance the virtual and the real. One is that the company that we started was taking the idea of, basically we looked at all these types of communications, business communications and, IMing and new types of communications, and, pretty much everything was going online, except there was this really very culturally sort of important type of communication, like people sending their wedding invitations, for example, that just hadn't. And 5 years ago when I would talk to people, that just seemed like anathema to them as well, that just wouldn't happen. But it seemed like anathema to us that they would say that because, the post office obviously wasn't gonna always be what it was, and it just doesn't make sense to communicate over distance when, have it take a month when it could take 2 seconds. So we basically created this product that looked exactly like the product that people are used to when they use Crane Stationery or Smythson or whatever. We went very much to the far end of the spectrum of being formal and ceremonial, and it was very contrary in our industry. People did not know why people would care about that online, but mainstream consumers understood that basically they wanted the same kind of fidelity of experience and self-expression that they got from paper, but they communicate online. So anyway, we built this company. We've sent over 100 million invitations, and it became very important life events, like events around people's weddings, also holiday cards, announcements. Like very quickly, people wanted to be using it for thank you notes and greeting cards, and so we basically. A year ago, actually, we started printing as well. So that's the first way that we, sort of span digital and physical. And we did that because basically it was our biggest user request, and so it was interesting and it used our core competencies, so it made sense, like design and the design tool. So it obviously is different than when you go to a brick and mortar store and design the invitation with someone, but we are delivering physical pieces of mail to people, and so that's one way in which we're spanning the two of them, and I can talk about that. The other is that we're a digital product that's bringing people together physically in the real world, and that is why the data that we have is interesting, because it's actually important social data. It's implicit, it's not explicit. You don't actually follow somebody or friend somebody, you go to their wedding, and we know that, and so that's the other way that we span the virtual and the digital.
Well, part of what's fascinating to me is it's almost sort of a boomerang effect, is you take something that existed in the real world, you made it virtual, you got information from your customers, part of which says, no, we want to go back to something I can touch, but you've got so much more information now because you were digital, because you've got this direct communication with them, and the customers are telling you that they want this thing. But, and I think Tara was talking about this earlier about fidelity as well. There's a quality level. It's, one of the things that I think you mentioned when we were talking on the phone is that at least in your space, the bar has been raised. And so a virtual thing, yeah, we can send anybody an email message, but if I got something I can touch, well, that's actually, you're saying something. It's what, when you care to send the very best, I actually got something that I can see. So you learn that in the interaction with your customers.
Yeah, basically what we've found, the online communication and even what we started out doing, which is still our core competency and main focus, which is self-expression online and being able to bring that type of important social messaging to the web. That actually the spectrum continues to paper. So like there's more gravitas with paper, and what the self-expression online has allowed paper to become is actually means even more than, basically paper means more than what it meant before. To send a paper invitation to somebody for whatever it is, whatever occasion it is making a statement, and it's just an interesting, it's interesting to think about these, we were talking earlier about products where the physicality of it was just an encoding mechanism, is that what you said? Like basically the whole purpose of the product could be achieved virtually. And thinking about that, like an invitation versus a taco. A taco has value physically.
It doesn't scream when you send it.
Necessarily.
It doesn't scream when you care to send the very best, but
right,
yeah,
exactly.
It's still good.
Anyway, so it's just made, so it's been interesting to see that, now basically a quarter of our revenue and climbing is from paper. Obviously, it's a higher price point item. But it's because it was in 60% of our users were asking for paper. So it actually really does have a place in this world. It just has a different place than it did before. And it's sort of, people like it for the archival quality of it and the statement of it. And, to send an invitation is one thing, digitally versus in paper. But to send a holiday card, we've noticed people do that in paper, like 85% of people do that in paper because the physical piece of paper could then go on their mantle and that means something to them. So it's taking a look at something that's existed for centuries that pretty much everybody does at a certain time in their life, certain times in their lives, and sort of deconstructs what we really need to be doing in paper and what we don't.
So you could argue that so the insights that you get from the digital that then tell you what to do in the real world, Kickstarter campaigns. I've got the Pebble here. That you put it out there. What would you want? Oh, I'll go build that. So it allows us to be able to actually make things better in the real world because we've got that information. So Vish, I want to turn to some of your perspective. You've spent a lot of time in the enterprise, and you've seen sort of the march of the use of technology in the enterprise. What are some of the places that virtual interaction and access to information is just knocking the cover off the ball, and where are some places where there are limitations, or where it's not, there's still a ton of work to go, or where it shouldn't go?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, and we talked a little bit about how you can have digital proxies for different things, even though it has a physical presence in the real world. I think that's one of the areas that I think is becoming pretty intriguing from an enterprise perspective, is that there's this information economy, or this information supply chain that's being created with enterprise goods, whether it's Nike, who has wellness applications associated with their sneakers, and they've got this digital footprint, this online capability that they can enrich the user experience with. I think similarly, we're seeing more and more digital processes becoming integrated with the edge of the enterprise. So now,
what do you mean by the edge?
So if I look at what is an enterprise edge in a historical context, it's my CRM, it's my ERP, and that's the edge.
So customer-facing information, you mean?
Exactly.
Okay.
So today, that boundary is becoming much more blurry. Because now I can take an external business process and integrate it with the enterprise and create a larger information supply chain that's going to augment things. So for instance, as a salesperson, you spend a lot of time on the phone talking to customers, and you want to be able to log those conversations and be able to search those conversations meaningfully to be able to document a particular sales process, which is a pretty typical workflow for an enterprise salesperson. Today, that happens very manually. I make a call, and then I log that call in CRM. Why couldn't those two processes be integrated, where it's actually logged, I link, search that voice, create different types of search objects now that I can pull out with some amount of relevance later to be able to find out whether a supplier committed to fixing a particular bug in 2 weeks versus 3 weeks, right? That type of documentation trail and that seamlessness of enterprise processes is really important. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of productivity gain that can be had from this new invisible economy, this new information supply chain that's being created. I think maybe the more darker side of it is it actually lending itself to lowering costs in an enterprise, and what is the friction point for that to become adopted? And I do think that today we're not seeing that, at least as a percentage of GDP. If you look at productivity gains, it's not materially apparent, right? We're sitting at around 2%, let's say, from 1995 to now. It's not fantastic improvements. It's not like during the building of the railroads where there was fantastic improvements in productivity. We're not actually seeing that. And I think some of the reasons why is that if I look at a typical enterprise, the CIO has a certain amount of authority in terms of how all these different capabilities are going to enable business to my business units. But if I take a look at this permeable nature of the enterprise edge and the way a business unit now can go to Amazon and create shadow IT, it creates complexity now in that enterprise. But there's not one central authority saying, here's the entitlements and the permissions and the identity. It's a bunch of different business units being very chaotic. And they're able to create and scale that complexity fairly significantly because the friction to take an enterprise application, putting in the cloud, as a for instance, is very low.
Right.
So I think that's created complexity, and it's created some of the multipliers that we've seen in enterprise IT investments that hasn't paced some of the productivity gains that we would have expected.
Right. Sorry to ask you to define the terms, but John Hagel from the Deloitte Center for the Edge is here, and which actually I guess is an oxymoron, but Center for the Edge. But I want to make sure we're treating the phrase edge correctly. So maybe this is just for any of you guys. But the challenge potentially, it sounds like, if GDP is not really significantly gone through a tear, and we're coming on 20 years of the web pretty soon, so I guess just about now. So is it just we overhyped it? Did we overthink what the internet was going to be able to deliver? I started a magazine called Interactive Week back in 1994, and we were constant cheerleaders for how we thought the internet was going to transform everything. Yet it sounds like, from an economical standpoint, it's actually been a mixed bag. It's we actually have not had that great massive change in an uptick in employment, and we certainly haven't seen a massive change in GDP.
I think the numbers are a little unusual because we're seeing enterprise size getting smaller and smaller, more people working from home, more private contractors. So I think some of the employment numbers don't reflect that, and we're seeing this interconnectedness. We were joking backstage that we're going to become cyborgs, but we actually all are, right? So we all connect to each other all the time. We always have, as part of our human nature. And I think the technology is allowing us to do that more easily, at lower cost, at longer distance. But the same thing is happening, right? I still want to connect to the folks around me. That's why we're here, actually. Right? Why'd you all fly here? Because you got to see those people in person. So I think part of that is we want to design environments that are a little more consistent with our human nature, that allow us to interact in ways that are much more interesting. We can be creative. We can get the emotions that you can through Facebook. You can do it on Skype. But in person, that bandwidth is just so much bigger.
Right.
Well, I think building on what Paul just said, another question, and John, who's in the audience, could actually talk to this better than I could, but where is the value going?
Yeah.
Because one of the really obvious things, if you look back over the last 20 years, we went through a decade of closed desktops and completely centralized IT control where, the consumer tech was moving incredibly quickly, and a great deal of the enterprise technology was not moving as fast, or at least was moving in very different, sort of a different pacing. The total rate of progress might have been okay, but it was much more, one step at a time. And of course, very few, or at least fewer large companies are now in sort of lockdown IT modes. There's a lot more of bring your own device, bring your own phone, because of course you can't ask anybody at this point to give up their iPhone or their Android phone because it's such an important part of their lives. And so in some ways, the last 20 years may be getting us to a kickoff point. Certainly if we look at bringing the rest of the world online, we're going to go from the 2 billion people who have data connections, the 2 billion people who have access to the internet through a terrestrial connection. There are the 5 billion feature phones, that used to be smartphones but are now feature phones because phones have gotten better, who don't have persistent data connections. So they tend to have voice and they tend to have SMS, but they aren't as connected to the net as all of us are really used to being. And fundamentally, and I'd actually really be curious, Vish's thoughts on this, because this is one of the great places where we are at the limits of the virtual, because it is the physical limitations of how are we going to get data connections into markets that don't have those data connections yet. What are the limitations of devices? What are the limitations of technology involved there? And like anything that happens at the edge or where there are currently limits, this should be the most exciting thing from an economic and business standpoint, because 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion more customers, that should be interesting to everyone. And what are we going to need to do to make that happen?
Yeah, and I think that it's a great point, because I think we're at this period in time where we might see some really staggering acceleration. And to me, it's, this virtual economy is going to be on a collision course with network effects, which has never really happened before.
Yeah.
Right? And as you proliferate these connections and you reduce the friction of some of these interactions to occur, I think you can get something that parallels what perhaps we've seen on Facebook, what happened with Amazon, what's happened with Google, in the actual economy from an enterprise perspective. When that happens, I think it'll be a tsunami. It'll be a big bow wave of change. The question is where are we on that scale, and when is it actually going to happen, and what's that tipping point for the network effects to take off?
Right.
And I do think that there's friction points. I think there's a natural gravity as things kind of start to spread out that creates friction. To me, it's like if I look at the sand dunes in a desert, it has this angle of repose around 30 degrees. It's because it's a combination of the wind coming in, piling on, and collapsing under the weight of gravity. So gravity and the wind combine to create this perfect angle of 30 degrees for what the slope of a sand dune should be. If I look at the same thing from a global perspective, I think there's a natural gravity, whether it's regulation, whether it's privacy, whether it's all these different things that are creating a drag effect on these things to multiply. So the question is how are those forces going to all combine to create this network effect, which I'm expecting, and how is that going to play out over the next 10 years?
Right. So I know obviously people in the technology arena typically are relatively optimists. So far I'm doing a very poor job at exploring some of the potential downsides. But Alex, I just want to ask you, one of the things Paul was talking about is that even though the way I inferred it was, even though we have a lot of digital communication, we actually want to come to these events, we want to interact with each other personally. And so do you think what you've seen in terms of first people sending their communications to each other digitally through paperless post and then wanting something physical, do you think that actually all that virtual interaction drives the need for more things that are physical, or what's the connection between them?
I think that these desires have always been here, and the question now that people have the choice of media is the choice of media just shows what they need in certain situations. I think that it's kind of shocking how often people don't want to. I mean, it's shocking yet perfectly obvious why people don't want to use paper as much as they did. But what's really interesting is that it's cool how much trust people put in our product, that they go and put 200 of the most important people in their life and say announce to them one of the most important messages, and then whatever that is, and then they get responses back from people all over the world within seconds, and that's like a very big interesting and emotional rush which happened before but over a longer time frame and less efficiently. And yeah, I mean that's really interesting, and that the fact that information now exists anywhere centrally, I mean, exists lots of places, but for us, we have this, now it's like 40 million unique people that are in this network that, a lot of whom have received a lot of things that are like this, all because we were paid for a long time and now we're freemium. There really are very important moments in people's lives. It's really interesting to see maps of that kind of social data.
Right. Fascinating. So I want to come back to, first I'm going to open up the questions for the audience in just a second. So please wave for a mic. But I want to come back to, Corey, you had mentioned kids, which is top of mind for me. I've got a 17-year-old digital native. He would spend a significant portion of his days playing video games, but it's actually, there's a lot of context switching going on. He's also Skyping with his friends, and he's also checking his Facebook. There's just a lot of different things that they're doing that is not just that single digital activity, but they're interacting with their friends, and they're also doing these activities in a very digital world. But it's a big challenge to try to keep the context right for a kid. to help them understand, okay, so maybe you should just turn the damn thing off and get outside and interact with your friends in the real world. You're a parent. How do you think about that?
So I think first, I wish the lights were up because I'd be curious. How many people did homework with the TV on? And anybody who doesn't put their hand up is lying. So, or not paying attention to us, which that's fine too. So look, when I was doing homework, so the TV was on or the radio was on and I was on the phone and I was doing homework, except when I was actually reading something else that was more interesting than homework. So, to some degree, this is not a new trend. I think an interesting question is, fundamentally, it is growing up with multimodal communication, changing our capacity to multitask, right? Like, one of the great studies you look at repeatedly is we keep studying whether people can multitask well. And of course, what you keep finding is that people don't multitask well at all. And even people who think they're good at multitasking are lousy at multitasking. It is the best possible way to destroy productivity. And the reality is, when you're 14 and you're on the phone and you're watching TV and you're doing homework, to some degree, none of those are really requiring the kind of, none of those are rocket surgery, right? So if you are distracted, that's okay. I hope we keep studying to see whether the kids who grew up with, so my daughter's 10, right? So she's got access to all this and has had access to all of it. I'll be curious to see, and I hope we do longitudinal studies to see whether these groups are any better. Certainly we've seen with players of video games, it turns out there are a bunch of spatial reasoning activities that video games do train you at. Like you're much better at chunking. Chunking is, so when we look out at groups, can we rapidly estimate how many people are out there? And the way we do this is we kind of group, like groups of 5, groups of 5, groups of 5. And it turns out if you play a lot of video games, you're much better at chunking than an average person. Right. And there are other similar experiments that have been run. And it wouldn't surprise me if we discovered other pieces that come along from having text, having video, and having all of these available on the same device, right? Because you have a tablet and you have a phone, and they can do all of these things. The piece that I don't think has changed for any of us as parents, and I don't think that we would disagree about this at all, is that you have a choice of a parent of how involved you are with what your kids are doing. And I would no longer let my daughter stop going to bed at night, which would be her choice, because she feels sleep is for the weak, and this is her goal in life, is to not sleep. And which is real trouble, because after one night of this, she is difficult. So, and so guess what? There is a bedtime, no matter how much she fights on this. And she would also play Minecraft all of her waking moments, right? And then not sleep, so she'd get more time to play Minecraft. And in a very similar vein, I'm not gonna just let her play Minecraft all day long. Right. And I'll go do the research that looks at, well, how much game playing is healthy for kids. And what you find is a lot of data that suggests under an hour a day for kids tends to be fine, and way more than that probably isn't. Right? So the data is out there. Going back to my first point, though, I don't think the tech is as foreign to us as parents as some of the tech was to my parents. My parents were a little bit baffled, or a lot baffled, by a personal computer. Right? They didn't have a sort of an intuitive sense of its capabilities. Mm-hmm. I have a decent intuitive sense for what a tablet or a phone can do.
Mm. Right. Yeah, I've never actually seen a rocket surgeon before. That's an interesting mashup. I'll have to check that out later. So
it is a new profession.
So,
it requires very careful attention.
Good.
Steady hands.
Good. Yeah, it's a good mashup. Fish, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, building on that same thought, I always look at what my kid can do. He's 4 years old and he can use an iPad and he can swipe on, and he has a tremendous amount of power at his fingertips that I probably wasn't able to wield at his age. But he also has a very commanding authority around abstractions, and he can abstract things and wield those abstractions much easier than I can. And what I've known as almost a power law in our industry is, once you're able to abstract things, I do it as a network infrastructure provider, we abstract our network, make it very simple for people to consume, and that creates, the scaffolding of capability that, vastly outpaces what I was doing at a fundamental level. It's like basically I can invent DNA, but he's putting it together and creating creatures, right? So to me, it's, a little bit of what is the power that he's able to wield with that? I can't almost conceive of it, and he's going to go on to do greater and greater things. So am I limiting him by, providing some amount of morality that I see, that you can't watch TV, or you shouldn't be playing all these games, or you shouldn't be buying those badges from that game that you're downloading from Apple iTunes, whatever it is,
Right.
are those things going to empower him at a later date? And I don't know what the unintended consequences of those are going to be, good or bad. And so it is kind of one of those philosophical things that, of course, you should never philosophize with your children, because that's not a great way to rear them. But in some cases, I do kind of consider it a bit of an experiment, and I want to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the worst things you do is judge other people's parenting, but I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I was using the example.
Sure.
I was using the example of, I was out getting takeout the other night, I think I told a couple of you, and there's two mothers, which could have been fathers just as easily, and two toddlers in high chairs. And sans technology, the mothers would have had to be interacting with the kids and playing with them, maybe they're playing with each other, and instead they were each on an iPad. And I guarantee those kids didn't know what planet they were on. They didn't know, where they were. But the mothers had, blissful silence, so they could talk between themselves. And sure, parents have done that. My parents plunked me in front of a TV in the 50s.
And look how that turned out.
And look how I turned out. So it can only lead to bad things. But the question for the challenge for a parent is, well, you do have a morality. You do have a perspective, and to give the kids enough of a structure to let them understand they need to be intelligent consumers of media, intelligent consumers of information, and when it's right to be interacting directly, and when it's maybe okay that some of it's interpolated by technology. Agree? Or?
I think you can also sort of simplify it and ask, is the thing that your child is doing a net positive, is it having net positive effects on your child or not? I mean, like obsessively and addictively looking at what other people are doing on their winter vacation, and then through the people you don't even know are doing on their winter vacation with people you don't even know, that probably isn't very good for somebody's sense of self and, thinking about how to, it's not really very respectful of one's own life. But, somebody who is playing games and actually really good at those games, let's say, and maybe has a team of 5 other people, and maybe they're in a town in northern India, actually know somebody like this that I work with, and through this experience is actually gaining a lot of confidence, and in the end it's a net positive, effect on that person. I think you can assess it that way too, and also you can probably think about what those types of behaviors would be not online. And then you're more familiar with making value judgments like that.
Right, and I'm going to have to grudgingly agree with you, because I watched my son in his early teens. He was the kind of kid who was not a sports kid. He was definitely an imaginative play kid. And then the alpha jocks are over here on this side of the playground, all knocking balls against each other and bumping chests and that sort of thing. But then when he got online and he could play some of the group games, he became the leader. He became the one directing them to do things, because he found a safe environment where he got the rules but didn't have the physical capability in the real world to do it. So I agree, there can be, and for the impact on his self-esteem was great. So again, in the right context, it can be positive. I keep sneaking a look to see if we have anybody raising a hand. I guess we all look like hors d'oeuvres.
There's one right.
Point. So good.
Right.
Yeah, right here,
There.
please.
Hi, Michael Smolens, .sub. Arguably, the massive open online courses, the MOOCs, have taken something and exploded into tens of millions of people around the world that are virtually trying to receive knowledge or education. And the results, the very, very early results that are in, are the completion rates of the courses are extremely low. And a very interesting phenomenon, which sort of is consistent with what you're saying, a lot of the MOOC providers are trying to provide online groups for discussion, and they haven't proved satisfactory yet. So what's happening primarily through Meetup is people in various countries and cities are creating very small Meetup groups so that when they're taking the same courses, they can meet up at a local bar in the Czech Republic and talk about that specific course. So talk about, how, when you talk about, I don't know what's going on in the brain, but in terms of learning and education and the ability to assimilate knowledge, people are finding that they need to have a physical interaction with other people that maximizes it, because they're trying to have a virtual interaction, and it's not working anywhere near as well as having that physical interaction.
I was going to say, Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm lined up to do a MOOC, and actually we put it on hold because we're trying to get that right mix, actually. And so part of this, I think, is the sort of TEDification of how you transmit kind of difficult information and make it fun, make it interesting. But the word in English for learn actually comes from the root for to show. And so I think the best learning is experiential, and that experience could be discussing it, could be doing it in a laboratory, and for teaching neuroscience, there's got to be a real physical component to that. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point, that actually having people meet at a physical location, talking about it, and they can self-organize, right? It don't need me to do that, but actually encouraging them to do that, I think, enriches the experience. So just like one of the last sessions, we're not providing information, we should be providing an experience, and that experience should be really compelling, interesting, it's kind of edutainment, but also a chance to explore. And to the extent that, all these virtual tools let us explore more deeply and explore as groups, I think that experience is much richer.
Yeah. Just to build on that, because I think this is one of those really amazing beachheads. If we can crack the code on it, it'll be historic. And the reason why is, in the vast span of time in industry, the two areas that really haven't gotten much productivity gains is healthcare and education. And the question is why has that been? And there's, Boehmel's cost disease and all these different economic theories that say why. But fundamentally, if you could apply MOOCs as a way to disrupt the way you teach people and the rate at which people learn, it would be a terrific beachhead. It would be just a signature piece that says we can actually get productivity gains in service areas like healthcare and education. And that could really transform, I think, society. So I think it's something to watch. If we can get that right,
Yeah,
it'll be historic.
One of the challenges of MOOC may just be the M part. It's just, the massive part is actually we need to take it down to a personal level to get the kind of learnings. So there's a question over here. Stuart?
Question for Corey.
Okay, sorry, Stuart, could you just identify yourself? So I'm sure everybody knows, but just in case.
Yeah, Stuart Brandon. Corey, Facebook's in your nice big new building. You guys clump people more than most companies. You do your hackathons, which are a lot of people in one space at one time. And you also put out of great social software. And I start wondering, what collaborative software does Facebook use apart from being in one place at one time?
So we use Facebook itself quite a bit. We are probably the world experts on using Facebook as a professional tool. And many features that have gone into Facebook over the years have actually been to make us better at building Facebook. So we use that a lot. We do co-locate people quite a bit. We had more of engineering in one place and more product development in one place than is the norm for tech companies in the Valley these days. And actually, if you were to come into our offices, you were describing the perfect coffee shop. Our workspaces are somewhere between a perfect coffee shop and a call center. I say that because our desk density is actually higher than most call centers, and which is unusual because you get a lot of crosstalk and you get a lot of just general noise, which ends up being something that at first feels like a challenge until you get used to working at it, and then you realize that the way Facebook works is it is fundamentally a pull communication culture. We are not a broadcast culture. We are you go seek out information and you go find it. And so our goal is how do we make hallway conversations scale? And the easiest tool is actually smashing people together. The next step after that is actually using Facebook and Facebook groups and Facebook Messenger constantly as tools. And I don't think we are currently using any non-Facebook tools significantly, but we are constantly pushing the edges of what Facebook itself can do to share information, everything from videos to text to carrying on most actual design discussions either in messenger threads or in groups rather than in email. And in fact, in a lot of ways, email is sort of you don't really need a response, you just kind of want it to be archived communication tool of choice.
So with just a little over a minute left on the clock, I just want to take my final trump card out of some of the potential downsides or limitations of technology and talk about privacy just really quickly. So I've continually missed this trend. I've just assumed that people are going to be up in arms about the loss of privacy, and it seems to have never happened. People never really get really upset about it. Do you see a loss of privacy with so much of our communication going online, and does it matter?
I think that's kind of a big question. Yeah, there's a loss of privacy, but I think some places people want privacy. Some places they actually were looking for a megaphone. And they, so I think that as long as people have control over, I think that's really frustrating is when you have, basically something you wanted to keep private was blasted on a megaphone,
Right.
or that.
Yeah, right. But at least in the past, if I wrote an analog letter, the likelihood that it's going to get plastered on the front page of tomorrow's paper is pretty low. If I do it digitally, if I send an email message, chances are really high. So basically, because so much of my life is digital, I've got far more information widely available, right?
But we're aware of that, I think. We've always watched each other. We're social creatures. And so now we just have to be a little more thoughtful about everything can go out, right? So I think that's okay. I think that's a big shift. Again, I think it's that merging. I think we're seeing a blending here. So maybe the key word from today's session is blend. It's a blend.
Right, okay, all right. And on that note, we're going to blend ourselves with the evening dinner period. So thank you all for your time.
Well, thank
Thank you
you.
for the panelists.